This week on Brian Ross Investigates.
Steven, amigo, el pueblo está contigo.
A crusading American lawyer in his fight against a giant oil company in the jungles of South America.
The whole idea of this case was to go into court and use the rule of law to get justice for people who've been wronged, had their lands polluted by Chevron.
But now he's the one in trouble, sentenced to prison by a U.S. federal judge for contempt of court.
It's now time to pay the piper. Accordingly, it is my intention to impose a sentence of 6 months imprisonment.
Are you prepared to spend 6 months in prison?
I don't want to go to prison. I want to continue my work.
Plus, American hate groups exposed. The secret membership and finances of the extreme right wing exposed in a massive hack of the internet site they thought would protect their secrets.
So it's a kind of who's who of America's hate groups?
You could say that.
The reporter who broke the story, targeted for harassment.
Hi, Steven. Do you want to talk about this? This is Joey Camp. I already have all your information, number, emails, previous employers.
We've allowed a right-wing terrorist groups and other hate groups to metastasize. We have to be very concerned.
And this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices made by the editors of Mediaite.
And I feel horribly guilty about my part in it because I was on Fox a lot.
From the Law&Crime Trial Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our friends on Facebook Live. I'm Brian Ross, joined as always by my colleague here at Law&Crime, Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with the story of a crusading American lawyer, Steven Donziger, who went to the jungles of South America to help the people there fight against a giant American oil company. But now he's in trouble, facing the prospect of 6 months in a U.S. prison for contempt of court, Rhonda.
That's right, Brian. Donziger's case has received worldwide attention, including from a UN human rights organization. And last week, before he received his sentence, supporters gathered outside the federal courthouse in New York to protest what was happening to him.
Chevron lies! People die! Chevron lies! People die!
We're not going to see promotion of respect for the law today. What we are going to see is somebody who is standing tall, has always stood tall, and who is so incredibly resilient in the face of what has been arrayed against him. We're going to see Steven Donziger accepting whatever it is that is imposed upon him and accepting it on his feet and with dignity.
And then Donziger's supporters listened to an audio feed as the judge handed down the sentence.
It's now time to pay the piper. Accordingly, it is my intention to impose a sentence of 6 months imprisonment. Although a fine is authorized for this offense, it is my intention not to impose one.
This is all designed to silence this campaign to hold Chevron accountable on behalf of Ecuadorian indigenous peoples. They don't want me speaking anymore. And what better way to do that than to put someone in prison for 6 months? I mean, it's an intimidation play.
None of this is surprising. The fact that it's not a surprise makes it no less vile and unjust, improper, unprecedented.
And we're joined now by Steven Donziger. Mr. Donziger, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Judge gave you the maximum sentence. She said you showed an astonishing lack of respect for the law and that you had been thumbing your nose, she said, at the judicial system for the last 7 years. And she said, now it's time to pay the piper. What do you say?
It's just not true. From my perspective, I have complied with the rule of law consistently for the last 30 years, fighting for the Ecuadorian indigenous peoples. I mean, the whole idea of this case was to go into court and use the rule of law to get justice for people who've been wronged, had their lands polluted by Chevron. What actually happened back in U.S. courts after the Ecuadorian courts won is Judge Kaplan, who appointed Judge Preska, issued a series of rulings that I challenged. I did what lawyers do. I appealed orders, I filed motions, and what Judge Prescott did on Friday was shocking to me because she interpreted every single one of those challenges to his orders as disobedience to the rule of law. And what Judge Prescott said is not the final word by any means. It will be ultimately decided by a court of appeals, and I have confidence that what she said about me will be completely overturned.
This grew out of reportedly your refusal to turn over certain electronic devices, notes, documents to Chevron so they could further sue you. Why didn't you turn them over?
Thank you for asking that. I mean, that really is the gravamen of the dispute related to my detention. Basically what happened was, in my computer are all sorts of privileged documents and information, communications with my clients, communications with other attorneys. And I've never said I won't turn over my computer under a valid court order. Judge Kaplan's order was so broad that Chevron would have gotten access to all kinds of privileged information, sensitive information. It would have put the lives of my clients, I believe, in danger because they would have gotten all of their personal data, people down in Ecuador I'm talking about. So I appealed the order of Judge Kaplan, and while I was appealing the lawfulness of his order, he charged me with criminal contempt of court for not complying with the order I was appealing. I don't believe I committed a crime. I mean, obviously Judge Prescott, without a jury, determined I did commit a crime. I don't believe I did, and again, ultimately it's going to be decided by the Court of Appeals, but I'm happy to turn my computer over as long as privileges, the privileged information can be protected so it does not fall into Chevron's hands.
It was striking to me that the U.S. Attorney's Office declined to prosecute you, so the judge turned it over to a private lawyer. That's really unusual.
It's shocking to me. First of all, it's very rare for a private lawyer to be appointed a public prosecutor in the United States. Almost never happens. And I'll say, the fact I've been locked up now in my home for well over 2 years, when no one else in my position has ever spent a day in home detention, that is a lawyer on a misdemeanor charge, I think can only be explained by the fact that I'm being prosecuted directly by a Chevron law firm and not by the U.S. government.
Mr. Donziger, you spent the last 2 years under house arrest. You've been disbarred in New York State as a lawyer. You're now facing 6 months in prison. But as your friends say, you keep smiling.
I can't really explain that. I am proud of the accomplishments of the people of Ecuador. This case is viable. A lot of people say, oh, you lost, you're in prison, your life must be miserable. And of course, it's terrible to be locked up. But the reality is, this is happening, Brian, in my view, because we've been successful. In other words, this is an historic achievement that indigenous peoples won a large pollution judgment against a major U.S. oil company, and the damage down there is undisputed. It's terrible. People are still suffering. So the fact that that accomplishment has happened gives me great satisfaction and might explain why I'm smiling. And I'm also blessed to be surrounded by a great family and great friends and great support, including, as you know, 68 Nobel laureates and all sorts of people of influence. So, this battle is far from over, and this story, the final chapters of this story are still being written, and I'm reasonably confident that ultimately the people of Ecuador will be able to collect on their judgment, even if I personally are facing, obviously, these extreme complications in my own life.
And as you face the prospect of 6 months in prison, are you prepared to spend 6 months in prison?
I don't want to go to prison. I want to continue my work. I think I've spent enough time detained in my home over 2 years for a misdemeanor, 4 times longer than the maximum sentence. But if I have to go to prison, obviously I'll go, and I'll do the best I can with it.
Steve Donziger, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Brian.
Mr. Donziger told me that if his appeals fail at a higher court, he expects to have to report to prison in about 3 or 4 weeks. Well, coming up next, America's hate groups, their secrets exposed after someone hacked into the internet site they thought would protect them. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network.
Hi, this is Dan Abrams with exciting news for all of our Law and Crime followers on YouTube. You can now get the live Law and Crime Network with YouTube TV for all of your daily live trial coverage, legal news, expert analysis, and original true crime programs. Subscribe to YouTube TV today and then locate Law and Crime in the channel guide. And for only $1.99 a month, you can add the network to your bundle. Watch Law and Crime every day with YouTube TV. We put you in the jury box.
Well, as we all know and have seen over the years, internet hackers have caused big issues and much havoc for banks, hospitals, even the Pentagon. Well, this week we're learning about a new target of the hackers.
America's far-right, white nationalist hate groups have relied on secrecy as they have tried to recruit new members and organize. But now one of the websites they have used to spread their ugly messages has been hacked. It's called Epic, and now all of the names and locations and plans of these groups have been made public. A very bright light has now been focused on their once secret details.
To learn more about this, we're joined now by Mia Bloom, the International Security Fellow at New America and a professor at Georgia State University, and Steven Monacelli, the freelance journalist who first broke the story. Steven, tell me and tell our listeners why this is so important. What is Epic?
So Epic is a web service provider. Now, they provide these services to a wide range of clients, but over the years, they've become considered a haven for far right-wing and hate group content. So we're talking about QAnon, conspiracy theories, white supremacists, and more. And so it is, not just your average everyday web provider, you could say.
And when they were hacked, what information came out?
So, it's been described as an embarrassment of riches or the Panama Papers of hate groups. It's a wide range of information, but I think most interesting to researchers and journalists is basically the entire customer base of the company, allowing for people to understand who actually was behind a lot of these websites that previously had been anonymized in terms of their ownership.
So it's a kind of who's who of America's hate groups?
You could say that.
Mia Bloom, you've written a book now, Pastels and Pedophiles, about QAnon. What's the impact on these groups of this huge leak?
Well, I think that Steven said it perfectly. This has been considered to be either like the Panama Papers or someone called it the Rosetta Stone, that it's allowing us to look behind the curtain to see who's really in charge of these conspiracy websites, but also who's making the money. And so with the release of people's names, their addresses, their email addresses, and even their passwords, it is a treasure trove that people are going through right now. But also it allows us to understand how groups like the Proud Boys or like QAnon are functioning and who's really manipulating things behind the scenes.
And Steven, is it fair to say they're not very happy that you've been reporting on this as you broke the story?
No, I don't think so. A customer of Epic who runs a website that basically all it does is dox people, which if you don't know what that means, it's effectively publishing things like someone's address, as well as perhaps even defaming them as a pedophile, and then directing harassment their way. So this individual who's been reported on by the Washington Post recently, his name's Joseph Camp, and he's been harassing me nonstop via text, defaming me, and basically spreading misinformation and disinformation about the nature of this hack since I first reported it. I got my first message from him 3 hours after I broke the news.
Hi, Steven. Do you want to talk about this? This is Joey Camp, and this is my number. You can verify it. I already have all your information, number, emails, previous employers. You used to work at Google, I believe. Social security number, we won't publish that, of course.
I kind of took that to be as a sort of intimidation tactic or an attempt to get me to stop reporting on something. He's since moved on to harassing a Washington Post reporter who has also reported on this and defaming her as a Nazi. It's quite ironic.
So far from what you've seen, what have you learned that you did not know?
I didn't realize that there were basically the same individual would be involved in as many as 100 different websites. But of course, we also saw, for example, they had hosted briefly the Texas anti-abortion website. They have been hosting groups that have posted hate material like Brendan Tarrant's manifesto from Christchurch.
What I think it does tell us is that there is a wide network of far right-wing extremist hate groups in this country. And, it's not necessarily something that is entirely on the fringe anymore. Consider how QAnon has become basically embraced by some of the highest levels of the Republican Party here in Texas, and that there are lots of QAnon folks running for office all across the country. I think what it tells us is, frankly, just the extent of what we're really dealing with in terms of a radicalized extreme far right movement in this country, and the variety of sort of threads and narratives that tie together to make this fabric.
I mean, part of the problem is that for the 20 years that we've been over-focused on the jihadi threat after 9/11, we've allowed a right-wing terrorist groups and other hate groups to metastasize. We have to be very concerned our democracy could be in jeopardy.
And finally, Steven, you're going to continue to be on the case, continue to report the story?
I fully intend to. I think the upshot of this story will, be falling down for weeks, months, years. There's simply just too much to be adequately reported on within a short period of time. And, frankly, for whatever reasons, the mainstream media has been a bit slow to cover some of this story. It's really only hit the Washington Post and CNN. So I think there will be plenty of time for larger institutions with more resources to be able to dedicate their focus to, digging out the stories that are still yet to be uncovered.
Well, Steven Monacelli, hats off to you for excellent reporting. And Mia Bloom, as always, thanks for joining us here tonight. Coming up next, this week's winners and losers in the media, as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network. Time now for this week's winners and losers in the media, as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. And we're joined by Aidan McLaughlin, who is the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, which, like the Law and Crime Trial Network, is owned by the Dan Abrams media empire. And Aidan, we begin with your first winner, John Berman of CNN's New Day, for his interview with former White House press secretary Stephanie Grisham.
They, by and large, didn't get tough with us. They just took what we were saying and disseminated it. And I think they're disseminating it to a lot of people who went to the Capitol for January 6th. And again, I've had a lot of time to grapple with this, and I feel horribly guilty about my part in it because I was on Fox a lot.
And Aidan, why did you choose John Berman for this interview?
So this was a fascinating multi-segment interview with Stephanie Grisham, who, as you said, was White House press secretary for Donald Trump. She's on a promotional tour for her new tell-all book, which is called I'll Take Your Questions Now. It's sort of an ironic title because as press secretary, Stephanie Grisham famously never held a press briefing. But she's now one of the many former Trump officials, now that they've left the administration, that are warning that the Trump administration itself was a pretty dangerous mess. I will say that of all the Trump turncoats over the years, Grisham is one of the more insightful. She has interesting insights about the inner workings of the Trump White House, including how the administration used the friendly turf of Fox News to promote the election lies that eventually culminated in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. There are also revelations in her book about Trump allegedly harassing young female staffers, which might be predictable, but I don't think it should be overlooked. And even though this New Day interview with John Berman was one of the many that Stephanie Grisham has done over the last week, it was by far the most newsworthy. It included a lot of news that we haven't heard yet from her book. And I think that's why John Berman, we really thought, triumphed in this interview.
John, a former colleague of mine when I was at ABC News and before he left for CNN, always does a fine job there with really precise questions. I guess the question for you is, as Stephanie Grisham and other former Trump aides try to seek redemption, essentially, is that working for them?
Well, I think it's hard to tell whether there's still an appetite for this kind of Trump tell-all. I don't know that many liberals are going to be clamoring to buy a Stephanie Grisham book, even if it is critical of Donald Trump, and just because there's been so many of them over the last 5 years. Grisham's book is currently number 5 on the Amazon bestseller list. It's behind Peril, which is Bob Woodward and Robert Costa's book. about the Trump White House. It's also behind Fiona Hill's memoir on her career as a foreign policy official, which includes a lot of commentary about the first impeachment trial of Donald Trump, in which she served as a witness. So 2 books about the Trump administration are currently doing better than Stephanie Grisham's. We'll see if her interview on CNN changed that.
All right, let's turn to your loser, your pick this week for the loser. A little-known media company by the name of Ozy, run by Carlos Watson. The company went out of business this week after revelations about its business practices in the New York Times, and the former owner, Mr. Watson, appeared on the NBC Today program.
Let's start with the status of Ozy as we sit right now. Reports that the company shut down on Friday. Is that true? Has the company shut down, or are you still open for business?
You know, we're going to open for business, so we're making news today. This is our Lazarus moment, if you will. This is our Tylenol moment. Last week was traumatic. It was difficult, heartbreaking in many ways. And at the end of the week, we did suspend operations with a plan to wind down.
Aidan, this company, Ozy, was raising millions of dollars from investors when it finally shut down after the Ben Smith report in the New York Times. Give us a sense of what happened there.
Right. So when you say a little-known media company, that's true, right? I don't think I ever came across organically a piece of Ozy content online. That said, it was a pretty big company. And that's because, as we learned in this New York Times reporting from Ben Smith last week, that Ozy founder Carlos Watson had somehow convinced investors to dump an enormous amount of money into Ozy. It ballooned to 75 employees by basically lying about its reach and how big its audience was, and by paying for the audience to inflate it. After these series of reports, Ozy announced that it was shutting down on Friday. Then on Monday, Carlos Watson, to the surprise of everyone, goes on the Today Show and says that Ozy's back open for business. It's very unclear what shape that's going to take. And in fact, the 75 employees that were laid off on Friday found out that it was restarting on Monday when he made that announcement on the Today Show. So it's just messy all around. It's unclear what sort of shape this is going to take going forward.
And as they say, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, yeah. Well, anyway, Aidan, thank you so much for being here with your insights today into the winners and losers in the media. And thanks to all of you for joining us here. And finally, a big thanks to our staff at Law&Crime for getting us on and off the air.